After my graduation party, I woke up in my college crush Michael's bed. He looked at me with disgust, threw me some money, and told me to pretend it never happened. For exactly 4 seconds, I believed I'd finally gotten everything I'd wanted since sophomore year. Michael Hastings. The man I'd secretly loved through 4 years of lectures, late-night study sessions, football games, and graduation countdowns. The man who had never looked at another girl the way I'd always dreamed he would look at me. My graduation dress was crumpled on the floor beside the bed. My head pounded so badly, I couldn't remember anything after 1 o'clock that morning. I smiled. Maybe the party had ended better than I'd ever imagined. "You're awake." His voice erased that smile instantly. Michael was already dressed, standing by the window with his back to me. When he finally turned around, the look in his eyes made my stomach twist. It wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't confusion. It was disgust. Without saying another word, he reached into his jacket, pulled out a thick stack of cash, and dropped it onto the bedside table. "Take a cab." I stared at the money, convinced there had to be some mistake. There wasn't. He wouldn't even look at me anymore. "Don't call me." A pause. "Don't text me." Then the sentence that shattered every dream I'd carried for 4 years. "As far as I'm concerned, last night never happened." I walked out of Michael Hastings' apartment believing the worst thing that had happened was having my heart broken. I was wrong. The worst part of that night hadn't even begun. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who might find it valuable. Now, let's get into it. 4 years of college, and I'd loved Michael Hastings the entire time from a distance that felt safe precisely because it was so obviously unbridgeable. He was the kind of golden that didn't happen by accident. Old money, easy charm, the kind of guy who remembered the names of the dining hall staff and made professors laugh without trying. I was Maya Bennett, scholarship kid, whitersing 30 hours a week to cover what my financial aid didn't, and I'd built an entire personality around pretending I didn't notice him noticing me back. Because he did notice. Junior year, we ended up partnered on a case study project and stayed in the library until it closed twice. He asked questions about my dad's hardware store like the answers actually mattered to him. He walked me home once in the rain without an umbrella, insisting he didn't mind, and I spent a week afterward trying to talk myself out of what I'd felt watching him get soaked rather than let me get wet alone. We never dated. There was always some reason: his family's expectations, my work schedule, the specific cowardice of 2 people who like each other too much to risk finding out it isn't mutual. So when graduation came, and with it the party at his family's lake house that half our class had been invited to, I told myself I wasn't going to leave without saying something. For years I've almost had to end in more than almost. I found him on the dock around midnight, away from the noise, a drink he wasn't really drinking in his hand. "I need to tell you something before we all scatter," I said, and my voice shook more than I wanted it to. "I've been in love with you since sophomore year. I don't need anything to come of it. I just didn't want to spend my whole life wondering what would have happened if I'd said it." He looked at me for a long moment, the lake lights reflecting in his eyes, and something in his face broke open in a way I'd never seen before. "Maya," he said, "I've been trying not to feel the same thing for 3 years." I don't remember who moved first. I remember his hand finding mine on the dock rail, the walk back to the house that felt like it took both no time and forever, the door of his room closing behind us like it was sealing something in rather than shutting something out. I remember thinking, right before I stopped thinking clearly at all, that whatever happened next, I would never regret this part. I was wrong about that. Not about the wanting it, I never regretted that. I was wrong about the never regretting part because 6 hours later, the man who told me he'd been fighting his feelings for 3 years looked at me like I was a stranger who'd broken into his house, and I understood, with the specific vertigo of watching your whole world reverse itself in real time, that whatever I thought had happened on that dock, it hadn't happened to him the same way it had happened to me. I didn't cry until the cab was 2 blocks away. Then I cried the whole 40-minute ride back to my apartment, the folded bills still sitting untouched on the seat beside me because I couldn't bring myself to put them in my purse, like touching the money would make the morning permanent in some way it wasn't already. I called him twice that week. Both times, it rang through to voicemail without a single ring, the specific silence of a number that's already been blocked. I wrote him a letter I never sent because I couldn't figure out what I was even asking for, an explanation, an apology, a version of events where the boy who'd walked me home in the rain hadn't turned into a stranger who paid me to disappear. I told myself it was a graduation fling that had scared him, some last-minute panic about what a summer romance might turn into once real life started. I told myself a lot of things that week, most of them designed to make the money on my dresser mean something other than what it obviously meant. 6 weeks later, sitting on the bathroom floor of the apartment I could barely afford, I understood that the money hadn't been the worst part of that morning. The worst part was about to have a much longer memory than either of us. I didn't tell my parents right away. My father had put himself in debt, keeping the hardware store open through 2 bad years, and my mother had cried actual tears of relief at my graduation, certain the worst of our family's hard years were finally behind us. I wasn't going to hand them a new crisis 6 weeks after the old one ended, not until I knew what I was going to do about it. I thought about calling Michael. I got as far as dialing the first 6 digits 3 separate times before I stopped myself. Whatever had made him look at me the way he had that morning, I didn't think a phone call was going to undo it, and I wasn't going to hand him a reason to look at me like that again, this time with a baby attached to the sentence. So I made a decision on a bathroom floor at 22 years old, the kind of decision that reshapes a whole life and doesn't ask permission first. I was going to have this baby, and I was going to do it without asking Michael Hastings for anything, ever, not money, not help, not an explanation I clearly wasn't going to get anyway. It took 3 more months before I understood how badly I'd need that resolve. My father's hardware store, the one that had survived 2 recessions and a highway rerouting that killed half the foot traffic in town, got a call from its landlord informing him the lease wouldn't be renewed. No warning, no negotiation, just a letter and a 60-day notice. I didn't think anything of it at the time beyond the ordinary devastation of watching my parents lose something they'd spent 20 years building. It would be 6 years before I learned the landlord's holding company had a name on its board I would have recognized instantly, if I'd ever thought to look. Eli was born the following spring, 7 pounds 2 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and a set of lungs that announced his opinions to the entire maternity ward. I named him after my grandfather, not after anyone I was trying to forget, though the nurses who cooed over how much he looked like his father never knew how loaded that comment was. The first 2 years were the hardest of my life, harder than I let anyone see. I worked 2 jobs while my mother watched Eli in the evenings, slept in increments that didn't deserve to be called sleep, and turned down every version of help that came with strings, including once a lawyer my roommate's cousin knew, who offered to help me file a paternity claim against whoever the guy was, free of charge because the case, in her words, sounded easy. I said no. I told myself it was pride. Some nights, staring at the ceiling with Eli finally asleep on my chest, I wondered if it was actually fear, that finding Michael again meant risking that look on his face a second time, and I didn't think I could survive it twice, not with someone else's whole future, depending on how I handled the fallout. Instead, I built something of my own. I'd majored in supply chain management, mostly because it was practical, and during my 2 years of exhausted, sleep-deprived nights, I started freelancing small logistics consulting jobs for local businesses that couldn't afford the big firms. It started as a way to make rent. By the time Eli turned 3, it had become Bennett Logistics Solutions, for employees crammed into a converted garage, servicing small manufacturers who'd been priced out of every larger firm's attention. I won't pretend the growth was some overnight fairy tale. There were years I nearly folded, a stretch where I sold my car to make payroll, a Christmas where Eli's only gifts came from my mother because I genuinely couldn't afford more. But I was good at the work, genuinely, provably good at it, the kind of good that gets you referrals instead of ad budgets, and slowly, the 4 employees became 14, then 40, then the kind of number that made regional business journals start using words like rising and disruptor next to my name. Eli grew up in the office as much as at home, doing homework at a corner desk surrounded by shipping manifests, informing my staff meetings with unsolicited 6-year-old opinions about which trucks were the cool ones. He asked about his father exactly twice, both times with the straightforward curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned that some questions carry weight for the person answering them. I told him the truth simplified. His father hadn't known about him, and it was complicated, and someday, if it ever made sense to, I'd explain the rest. He accepted this the way kids accept most things adults tell them, provisionally, without much interest in interrogating it further, because there was a truck outside worth looking at instead. By the time Bennett Logistics Solutions had grown into a company with regional contracts and a reputation for solving problems bigger firms wouldn't touch, I hadn't thought about Michael Hastings in any sustained way for over a year. I'd built a life that didn't have room in it for a man who'd once handed me cab fare like I was something he needed to dispose of quietly. I had no idea that life was about to put us both in the same conference room. The email came from my head of business development on a Tuesday, subject line, Hastings Industries, RFP, Regional Distribution Contract. I almost deleted it without opening it, assuming it was routine, the way most of our incoming requests were. It was not routine. Hastings Industries was putting its Midwest distribution contract out to competitive bid for the first time in a decade, a deal worth more than our entire annual revenue, and my company had made the shortlist of 4. I told myself the name meant nothing. Hastings wasn't an uncommon name, and companies that size have thousands of employees who never touch the family that founded them. I told myself this right up until the shortlist meeting when the deal lead on the other side turned out to be listed as Chief Operating Officer M. Hastings, and even then I told myself it could be a cousin, an uncle, anyone but the specific person my whole body had apparently never stopped bracing for. It wasn't anyone but him. He walked into the conference room 11 minutes late, the way important men are allowed to be, and stopped dead in the doorway when he saw me at the head of the opposing table. 6 years had changed him. Sharper suit, tired eyes, a stillness that hadn't been there in college, when he'd moved through rooms like he owned an easy claim on all of them. It hadn't changed the way my chest tightened at the sight of him, which infuriated me more than anything else that morning. "Ms. Bennett," he said, recovering fast, professional in a way that felt like armor. I wasn't aware Bennett Logistics was on the shortlist. I wasn't aware Hastings Industries had promoted you to COO, I said, matching his tone exactly, giving him nothing. Congratulations. The rest of the meeting happened the way business meetings happen, numbers and timelines and service guarantees, and I performed competence so thoroughly that by the end of it, one of his colleagues actually complimented my presentation, unaware that I'd spent the entire 90 minutes with my pulse in my throat, watching a man I'd once loved take notes like I was a stranger he was mildly impressed by. He caught me in the hallway afterward, alone, his colleagues already gone ahead toward the elevators. "Maya," he said, and something in the way he said my name made it clear he'd been rehearsing it since he walked in the door. "Can we talk?" "Not about the contract." "There's nothing to talk about." I kept walking. "You made that extremely clear 6 years ago." "I got the message. I even got cab fare." He flinched at that, the same flinch I remembered from the morning I'd woken up in his bed, and for one unguarded second, something raw crossed his face. Not defensiveness, not the polished COO mask, something that looked disturbingly like grief. "That morning wasn't what it looked like," he said quietly. "I've wanted to tell you that for 6 years, and I didn't have the right to, and I still might not, but I need you to at least know it's true." I stopped walking. I didn't turn around right away because I needed a second to decide whether I believed him, and a longer second to decide whether believing him was something I could afford to survive twice. "You have 5 minutes, I said finally. "Then I have a company to run, and a 6-year-old at home who's never once heard your name attached to a reason." The elevator doors opened behind him. He didn't move toward them. 6-year-old, he repeated very quietly, like the number had rearranged something in his chest, and I understood, watching his face do the arithmetic in real time, that he was about to learn the second half of what that morning had cost both of us. We ended up in a coffee shop 2 blocks from my office, the kind of neutral ground that felt safer than either of our conference rooms. He sat across from me with his hands wrapped around a cup he never drank from, the same nervous stillness he'd had in the hallway. "Is he mine?" he asked. Not really a question. His voice already knew. "His name is Eli," I said. "He's 6. He has your exact laugh, which is a genuinely unfair thing for genetics to do to a single mother trying to move on." Michael closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, they were wet, which was the last thing I expected from a man who'd once looked at me like I was an inconvenience he needed to itemize and pay off.
6 years, he said.
"You've been raising him alone for 6 years, and I've been in the same city the entire time. You made it very clear you didn't want to be found," I said. "I took you at your word. It seemed like the least I could do, given you'd priced it so specifically. That money," he stopped, pressed his palm against his eyes. "Maya, I need you to know that morning wasn't me. I mean, it was me, my mouth, my hand putting that money on the table, but it wasn't a decision I made freely, and I know that sounds exactly like the kind of thing a man says when he wants forgiveness he hasn't earned." "Then don't ask for forgiveness," I said. "Just tell me what actually happened, and I'll decide what to do with it." He told me. "My mother," He said Eleanor had come to the lake house that morning, before I'd even woken up, having heard from someone at the party the night before that Michael had disappeared upstairs with the Bennett girl. She hadn't knocked. She'd simply arrived in his room while I was still asleep, informed him with total calm that a relationship with a scholarship student with no family standing was not a conversation she intended to have twice, and laid out, in specific and immediate terms, exactly what it would cost if he didn't end it that morning, cleanly, in a way that guaranteed I wouldn't come looking for a second conversation. She had leverage on your father's lease, he said. The building your dad's store was in, it was owned by a holding company. I didn't know until years later that the company was one of ours, one of the smaller ones under the family umbrella, one my mother controlled directly without my father's involvement. She told me that morning, explicitly, that if I didn't end things with you immediately and completely, she'd have the lease terminated within the month. I didn't believe her. I want you to know I didn't believe a mother could actually do something like that to punish her own son's feelings.
His jaw tightened.
Then I found out, 2 months later, that the lease had been terminated anyway. Not because I'd failed to end it convincingly enough. Because she decided the risk wasn't worth leaving to chance. The room tilted slightly. I thought about the 60-day notice, my father's face at the dinner table the night he told us, the years of rebuilding that followed. The store, I said slowly. That was her. I didn't put it together until it was already done, Michael said. By the time I understood what she'd used as leverage, I'd already said everything she told me to say to you. Already put that money on the table because she told me a clean break required one. Already convinced myself it was better for you if I made it look like I didn't care, because the alternative was watching her destroy something else if I didn't sell it convincingly enough. He looked up at me, and the raw thing in his face wasn't asking for absolution anymore, just permission to keep talking. I've spent 6 years telling myself I did an ugly thing for a decent reason. I didn't know there was a version of it that had your son standing in the middle of it the whole time. I didn't forgive him in that coffee shop. I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story where 6 years of silence gets undone by one good explanation isn't the version that happened. What I did was believe him, which was its own kind of earthquake, because believing him meant the morning that had reshaped my entire adult life hadn't been about me at all. It had been a transaction between a mother and a son that I'd simply been standing in the blast radius of. I need to meet him, Michael said. Whatever you decide about us, about the contract, about any of it, I need to know my son. If you'll let me. I thought about Eli's 2 questions about his father, both answered with the same careful, simplified honesty. I thought about how a 6-year-old deserved more than a simplified answer once the real one existed. Slowly, I said. On my terms, at my pace, and if you ever make him feel the way you made me feel that morning, I will end this so fast you won't have time to apologize a second time. That's fair, he said. That's more than fair. Eleanor Hastings requested a meeting with me 4 days later, which told me Michael had already told her what he knew. She arrived at my office in a suit that cost more than my first year's revenue, sat across from my desk with the composed stillness of a woman who had never once had to raise her voice to get what she wanted, and opened with, "I assume Michael has told you his version of events." "He's told me the truth," I said. I checked the property records myself before this meeting. The holding company matches. The timeline matches. I don't need a version, Mrs. Hastings. I have documentation. Something flickered across her face, brief and controlled, the look of a woman recalculating a strategy she'd assumed wouldn't need one. I did what I believed was necessary to protect my son's future, she said. You have to understand, a scholarship girl with a struggling family, a child born out of an unplanned relationship, it would have derailed everything he'd worked toward, everything our family had built for him. He was 22, I said. You didn't protect his future. You took a decision that belonged to him and made it for him, using my father's livelihood as the lever, and then you let your son believe for 6 years that he'd done something honorable by being cruel to me. I raised your grandson alone in an apartment with a broken heater because you decided my family's business was an acceptable casualty in a negotiation I didn't know I was part of. Eleanor's composure cracked, just slightly, at the word grandson, like she hadn't fully let the fact settle into a shape with weight until I said it out loud. I would like to meet him, she said, quieter now. That's not your decision either, I said. It's mine, and eventually, when he's old enough, it'll be his. Right now, you don't get to walk into my son's life with the same certainty you walked into mine 6 years ago and expect it to go the same way. She left without another attempt at negotiation, which I understood. From the brief flash of something almost like respect in her expression, was as close to acknowledging she'd lost as a woman like Eleanor Hastings was capable of. Michael met Eli on a Saturday in the park, an arrangement I'd negotiated with the precision of a hostage exchange. Public place, my presence throughout, no promises made to a 6-year-old that weren't guaranteed to be kept. I told Eli only that a friend of mine wanted to meet him, which was, strictly speaking, not the whole truth, but I wasn't ready to hand my son a father figure and a grief he'd never had to carry, both in the same sentence, until I knew this was going to last. Michael showed up early, which I noted, and brought a soccer ball instead of an expensive gift, which I noted even more. He crouched down to Eli's height without being told to, which is the kind of instinct you can't fake, and asked him about the trucks on his backpack with a specific, genuine interest that had nothing performed about it. I watched from a bench 20 feet away as my son, who guarded his trust more carefully than any 6-year-old I'd ever met, decided within 11 minutes that this new person was worth showing his favorite tree-climbing spot. I cried a little, sitting on that bench, in the specific way you cry when something you'd stopped letting yourself want quietly starts happening anyway. It took months, not one park visit, to become something real. Michael showed up every week he said he would, which turned out to matter more to Eli than any of the bigger gestures Michael occasionally, cautiously offered and I occasionally, cautiously allowed. He learned Eli's teacher's name, his best friend's name, the specific way he liked his pancakes cut. He never once tried to buy his way into a relationship. He'd have to earn the slow way, which I think surprised him as much as it did me, that the money he'd once thrown at a problem to make it disappear was the one currency that would have gotten him nowhere this time. The business deal closed somewhere in the middle of all that, almost as an afterthought. Hastings Industries awarded the distribution contract to Bennett Logistics Solutions on its merits, a decision Michael recused himself from entirely, insisting on an independent evaluation committee so no one, including me, could ever say the contract had been a favor instead of a fact. It was the right call, and it was also, I noticed, exactly the kind of decision his mother would never have made, protecting the integrity of something instead of controlling its outcome. Eleanor didn't disappear from the story, though her role in it shrank considerably. Michael told her, in terms I only heard secondhand but believed completely, that any future relationship with him or with his son ran through honesty from that point forward. No exceptions, no leverage, no more decisions made on anyone else's behalf. She agreed, mostly because the alternative was losing both of us entirely, and I think some real, if overdue, understanding of what she'd cost him finally landed somewhere underneath the composure. She met Eli for the first time 7 months after that park bench conversation, in my living room, with rules I'd set and Michael had enforced without complaint, and cried in a way I suspect she hadn't allowed herself to in decades. I won't say I forgave her. I will say I stopped needing her to earn something for me in order to move forward, which turned out to be a different and more useful kind of peace. Michael and I didn't fall back into each other the way stories like this sometimes promise, fast and cinematic. 6 years of separation dissolved by one honest conversation in a coffee shop. It took over a year of him being steady before I let myself trust steady as a pattern instead of a performance. We dated slowly, quietly, mostly around Eli's schedule, two adults relearning each other with a specific caution of people who already knew exactly how much the other one could cost them if it went wrong again. What convinced me, in the end, wasn't a grand gesture. It was a Tuesday, 18 months after the park bench, when Eli came down with a fever at 2 a.m, and I called Michael without fully deciding to, more instinct than plan, and he was at my door in 11 minutes, still in the shirt he'd clearly slept in, asking what he could do before he'd even taken his coat off.
There was no performance in that.
Just a man who'd shown up, the way he'd been showing up for over a year, the way it turned out he'd wanted to show up for 6 years before that, if a single ugly morning hadn't convinced him the cost of trying was higher than the cost of walking away. We got married 2 years after the coffee shop, a small ceremony, deliberately small, with a guest list that didn't include anyone who'd ever handed anyone else cab fare as an apology. Eleanor came. She sat in the second row, not the first, which felt like the right amount of room for a story that still had some distance left to close. My father, whose store had reopened 3 years earlier in a building I'd personally made sure had no connection whatsoever to any Hastings holding company, walked me down the aisle with the specific pride of a man who'd watched his daughter build an entire life out of a morning that should have broken her. Eli, 8 by then, served as ring bearer with the total seriousness he brought to every important job, and cried, actually cried, hiccuping, overwhelmed sobs, when Michael picked him up at the reception and told the room, microphone in hand, that the best part of the last 2 years hadn't been falling back in love with his wife, though that part had been good too. It had been getting to know his son from the very beginning of being known as his father, instead of arriving 6 years late to a life that had already learned to run without him. I think about that morning sometimes, the money on the nightstand, the specific cruelty of a man who I now understand was performing someone else's script under threat of losing everything he thought mattered. I don't excuse it. I don't think Michael excuses it either. He's told me more than once that no explanation makes that morning something other than what it was, an unforgivable 10 minutes wrapped around an entirely forgivable 6 years of consequences neither of us chose. But I've stopped needing that morning to be the whole story. It was the worst 10 minutes of my life, and it built, eventually, without either of us planning it, into the best one. Some mornings cost you everything. This one eventually gave almost all of it back. Was Eleanor let off too easy? Or did the story get the balance right? Drop justice if you think she paid enough. Drop not enough if she should have lost more than a seat in the second row. Should Michael have found out about Eli sooner? Or did 6 years make the reunion hit harder? Comment sooner or worth the wait. Your votes decide how ruthless or how soft the next reunion story gets. If this one got you, like the video, subscribe for the next reunion and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one dropping.